And as we begin our time together on this webinar, it is important to acknowledge the enduring presence of Indigenous peoples on the land upon which we are now enjoying this virtual meeting. We are participating today from across many parts of what we now call Ontario, or even beyond to other parts of Canada, on land which was originally governed under different treaties signed in peace. And it is for that peace in which we can gather today, particularly those of us who are non-Indigenous people or settlers, that we are indeed grateful. One of the principles of reconciliation, which opens the 94 calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, states, reconciliation is a process of healing relationship that requires public truth sharing, apology, and commemoration that acknowledge and redress past harms. May our time together today, and indeed all our days, be marked with this principle of public truth sharing, apology, and commemoration, which will lead us to redress the harm which we acknowledge has been done to the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people of this land, a gift from the Creator, and so be it.
Thank you very much, Deirdre. Hi, everybody. I'm Tom Cooper. I am director of the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction, and like to thank everybody for taking time out of their lunch hour or late morning, early afternoon, wherever you happen to be in Canada, to join us on this very special panel looking at the future basic income in Canada. We have a distinguished group of panelists here with us today, so I'd like to move right into their introductions, and then we'll get to some questions. First up, Hugh Segal. Hugh has had a storied career in public service. He's been Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Mulroney, Principal Secretary to Premier Davis, and of course served for many years in the Senate of Canada, where he was on the standing committee as co-chair for social affairs. He's negotiated some of the most important agreements in this country's history, including the patriation of the Constitution and NAFTA. And he's more recently served as principal of University of Toronto's Massey College. And of course, he's an author of many books. And we'll soon be, I think, seeing a new book on bookshelves. It's called Bootstraps Need Boots, One Tory's Lonely Fight to End Poverty in Canada. Thank you very much, Hugh, for joining us on the panel today.
Delighted to be here.
I'd also like to introduce Kathleen Wynne. Kathleen was first elected as MPP for Don Valley West in 2003. She's been Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing, Minister of Aboriginal Affairs, Minister of Education, and of course in 2013, she became Ontario's 25th Premier, a role she held until 2018. Known to many of us affectionately as Ontario's Social Justice Premier, she's dedicated her life to building a province based on fairness, on diversity, on collaboration, and creativity. Thank you very much, Kathleen, for joining us.
Pleasure, Tom. Thanks for having me.
I'd also like to say hi to Joe Ceci. Joe represents the riding of Calgary-Buffalo in the Alberta Legislative Assembly. He served in Alberta's first ever NDP government as Minister of Finance and President of the Treasury Board. Prior to that role, Joe served as a city councillor in Calgary for 15 years and was absolutely instrumental in Calgary's poverty reduction efforts. I haven't talked to Joe in a while, but I'm guessing he's probably still a Calgary Stampeders fan, despite the fact that our Hamilton Tiger Cats are holding the best record in the CFL currently, Joe. But nevertheless, welcome, Joe. Great that you could join us.
Thanks very much. Great to be here. And Stamps won the Grey Cup last year.
Last but not least, I'd like to welcome Hannah Bell. Hannah Bell was elected as the second ever Green Party MLA in Prince Edward Island. Last spring, the Greens, for the first time in Canada, became the official opposition in a provincial legislature. She now serves as opposition House Leader and critic for social development and housing. Prior to her election, Hannah was executive director of the PEI Business Women's Association and has held many roles both in the province. Thank you for joining us, Hannah.
Thanks so much, Tom. It's great to be here.
So I'd like to get right into our questions. I'm going to start out with a number of questions for our panelists, looking at the future of basic income in Canada, as well as a little bit about the past. And then hopefully we'll have about 10 or 15 minutes at the end of this call for some audience questions as well. So we'll be keeping an eye on those questions. So feel free to type in your questions. We'll try to get to them. If we can't, feel free to send them anyway, and we'll pass them along if we can't get them to them in the full hour today. So I'd like to start out my first question to Hugh Siegel. 10 years ago, after your Senate report that you co-authored with Senator Eggleton in From the Margins, it recommended testing basic income. I think it was a bit of a groundbreaking report at the time, and made strong recommendations about basic income. Hugh, do you think the idea of basic income has now reached a tipping point in the Canadian political landscape and in public discourse?
Well, I think generally in public discourse across what I would call, what we used to call the Western world, there is a genuine realization that the gap between the very, very wealthy and those living beneath the poverty line has gone on for too long, and it is in fact quite substantial. And so there are tests going on around the world. In Kenya, in several cities in the Netherlands, in Scotland, in Stockton, California. And there's a very creative process, collaborative, and I defer to Hannah Bell on this, but there is a very creative process that is multi-party in the province of Prince Edward Island, where a very hardworking committee of the legislature dealing with poverty abatement is addressing what a pilot project might look like in their own province. So I'm optimistic that we are beginning to see the growth of an awareness that existing welfare programs, with all the constraints associated therewith, some of the administrative costs, are not really doing what they should be doing, and in fact they are a positive disincentive to social integration, to work, and a whole bunch of other issues. I would also say that generally speaking, a lot of the disaffection that we see across Europe, certainly in the United Kingdom, certainly in the United States, from large groups of voters, is tied to an intrinsic sense of unfairness in our society. And I think the basic income proposal, however it may differ region by region and province by province, is one of those instruments of fairness and opportunity which provides hope and impetus for folks who believe that a democratic society and a productive society can also be a socially just society.
Great, thank you very much, Hugh. I'm going to move to Kathleen Wynne now, because you did announce plans for a basic income pilot in 2016. Speaking personally, it was a bit of a surprise to many anti-poverty advocates in the province, and it was recognized as a bold experiment and a courageous one. So I'm curious, what led you to take that step? Was it a gradual realization that our income security system was broken and needed to be fixed? Or was there a moment of inspiration that compelled you to test the idea of basic income, Kathleen?
It's a great question, Tom, and I want to give credit to Hugh, because Hugh has been instrumental in this conversation, I would say nationally, but certainly in Ontario. The genesis of the idea for me is rooted in my belief that, you know, the reason to be in politics is to find ways to level the playing field, to create that inclusive economy that I think leads to a better society. And I think we can point to lots of examples around the world and in our own country where that has been true. But the specific genesis of the basic income pilot in Ontario was that I served on a committee that came out of our Women's Caucus. When we were elected in 2003, the new Liberal government, we created a poverty reduction committee as a result of work that our Women's Caucus did. And out of that came things like our move to put in place the Ontario Child Benefit, which put money in the pocket of families for their kids that had not been there before. But I also, at the time, working with Deb Matthews, who was chairing that committee, we talked about what needed to come next. We read the MINCOM results. We looked at what had been done, decades before. And when I became premier, I had the opportunity to say to my team, we've got to try something, because at the same time, Tom, we were already starting to do social assistance reform. I felt that it was going to be very incremental, and I wanted to try something that it seemed had some real potential to make a huge difference.
Great, thanks. And you asked Hugh Siegel to come up with a report on what that basic income pilot might look like. So back to you, Hugh. The negative income tax model you recommended in the Ontario pilot has really been discussed in Canada as probably the most feasible way to implement basic income, as opposed to a demogrant model, which is something that's currently been proposed by one of the candidates in the United States running for the Democratic nomination, Andrew Yang. So a question for you, Hugh, is do you feel that a more targeted negative income tax model targeted towards lower income Canadians is still the best approach for basic income, and why, or why not?
Well, first of all, Tom, because of our own experience, it was Ontario under a minority government back in 1975, which brought in something called the Guaranteed Annual Income Supplement, or GAINS, gains, for everybody 65 and over, and that ended up being a very constructive model. It made sure that no one lived beneath a certain level, and it ultimately became national, the Guaranteed Income Supplement for all Canadians 65 and over. And so there is a strong both constructive experience and I think a cultural acceptance that it makes a bit more sense to help people and top them up in a way that respects their privacy and through the tax system with a refundable tax credit, so that no one lives beneath a certain level. There's a floor we can all depend on. Than it does to send $1,000 a month to everybody, whether they're earning $350,000 a year or whether they're earning $18,500. And the notion that the tax system would be so efficient that those who are earning above the poverty line would have that money all taxed back, I think is a bit optimistic, because it's just part of reality that those folks who earn more money often retain advisors to maximize their ability to manage the tax system as efficiently as possible. So I'm not sure that would be quite as much of a recoup as those who offer the demogrant as an option suggest. But I think the top up, the negative income tax, has the value of being universally applicable, governed by the privacy relationship that exists between CRA and every single citizen, and the discretion involved in automatic deposits to people's bank accounts, which we've been doing with the HST tax credit now for many years. So I thought that that was the model that should in fact be tested, and that was my proposal to the province. Okay,
Fascinating, Keith. Thank you very much. And we, of course, know that the Ontario pilot was launched in 2017, late 2017, and sadly was cut short by the newly elected provincial government. And we won't get into those gory details, but needless to say, there were learnings. There was interim data provided to government through a baseline survey. There were surveys conducted that showed the impact on participants' health, on their housing security, as well, for me as an observer in the Hamilton community, which was one of the pilot sites, really the restoration of dignity for people who were able to get on the basic income pilot was astounding. And so my question back to you, Kathleen, is do you feel we know all we need to know given the data and the personal stories that have come back from pilot participants? Or do you feel governments, not just in Ontario, but really across Canada, still have more to learn? Do we need more pilots, or do we know enough that we can continue to implement basic income as policy?
So first of all, you know, what we started to see were the kinds of results exactly the kind of results that we were looking for. Improvements in health outcomes, in education retention, and people able to find a way to get themselves back into the economy. You know, people talking to me about buying a truck or being able to get the clothes to wear to a job interview, those kinds of things that facilitate people being able to take part in their community in a way that has dignity. So I think that we collectively have enough information to take the next step. I'm not in that office now, Tom, obviously. But if I were, what I would be doing is sitting down with my advisors and saying, okay, exactly what have we learned? Let's look at what we've been doing in terms of reform of social assistance, and let's figure out how we can bring these conversations together. You know, what is it that we can see as possible as a result of the basic income pilot that would allow us to adjust how we deal with how we deal with the reality that there are people who continue to need that support. And I think the need to do this is really urgent, Tom. I think that the fact of technology, you know, yes, we're talking about poverty reduction. We're also talking about economies that are making a transition, and people are being displaced, and that's going to happen more and more. And so I believe we have enough information to start to roll out some changes that would simplify the process, that would rely on the principles that Hugh put in place in terms of the pilot. And I'm not saying that we have there'd be a magic wand and you could immediately implement a whole program, but I do think we've demonstrated that it's possible. We've demonstrated that there is, a really clear set of positive outcomes. They'd have to be quantified, and I know we would take heat from some researchers, and we'd have to work with the researchers, and because we took heat from researchers on the model that we put in place. But I believe that we could take the next step at this point. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Kathleen. So I'm gonna move to Hannah. And Hugh referenced this in terms of a collaborative process taking place on the island, looking at what a new basic income pilot may look like. So Hannah, for you, a new minority government was formed last spring. What's the current status of basic income discussions in PEI, and is the new pilot in your future?
Well, the short answer is encouraging and yes, but the background in that is that even prior to the current minority government, this House had been talking about, substantively talking about basic income. In fact, there was an all-party motion that was brought forward by, at that time, the lone Green MLA, Peter Bevan Baker, that received all parties' unanimous support to sort of seek to negotiate for basic income working with the federal government. Where we are now, though, is like, as you said, in a minority, in a very different space, because for the first time, really in the history of the legislature here in PEI, we are engaging in discussion party to party, but we are also have made a fundamental change to the structure of our committees. And that's actually way more important than it may initially sound. What's happened is we've been able to effect a rules change that says that there are no longer government majorities on any committee, whether they're standing or special committee. And instead, there is a parity of membership of representative of each party in the House. So the Rules Committee or the Public Accounts Committee or whatever all have the same structure of membership, and there is no majority of any one party voice there, which makes them effectively a more non-partisan space. What happened in the first sitting of this minority government was the opposition had obviously had a strong policy. The Green Party as opposition had a strong policy through the election and into the House that basic income and eliminating poverty, not just reducing poverty, was our goal. And so we were able to effectively get that included in the throne speech, which becomes really critical because then it's a commitment from government to act on that as a priority. And then through other activity in the House, we were able to actually strike a special committee specifically on poverty with a very clear mandate And that special committee is looking at three things. It's looking at establishing a clear set of measures and benchmarks for poverty and how we reflect that in policy. It's about setting a living wage, but it's also committed to, within 12 months, coming back with recommendations for a costed basic income pilot in the province. So it's really substantive commitment. We're going past talking about, and we're talking about action, and that is a pretty amazing place to be.
Yes, absolutely. It's amazing. Congratulations.
Thank you.
To Alberta now, and Joe, you're finance minister, as I mentioned in the intro. You're a city councillor in Calgary, and also played a key role in Calgary's poverty reduction efforts. So you've been in a unique position of seeing the issue from both sides. And as finance minister, you invested in the Alberta Child Benefit, which was immensely popular and successful. You increased income supports and increased the minimum wage to $15 as well. So I'm curious, what role did you see basic income potentially playing in Alberta's future as a policy or as a discussion point?
Well, it wasn't much of a discussion point, unfortunately. You know, we had 44 years of conservative rule here, and so there was much that needed to be done on the social justice side that we immediately went after. I was, of course, aware of basic income pilots historically and more recently in Ontario, and saddened to see that not continued, of course, with the new government. But what we chose to do, and what the Premier of the day, Rachel Notley, came into office saying, if she's going to do anything, it's going to be to work on an affordable childcare program throughout this province. And so we did incredible work on $25 a day childcare with pilots throughout the province, hundreds of places where parents could pay $500 as opposed to the $1,000 or more they were paying a month for children. And so we really made that the start. With greater affordability for families. That was having great work. And then we started looking at all, in Hugh's words, all the things that would make our society more just. For instance, $15 an hour, as you mentioned, minimum wage. We eliminated payday lending. We went after reducing the cost of school fees for families, bringing nutrition into schools. So we started to do all these things that put more money into the pockets of families. And frankly, we weren't thinking much about basic income. We were thinking about all the things that have been so long in coming and needed to happen in this province. Regrettably, now the new government seems to want to unwind all of those things, but we're kind of fighting tooth and nail to keep them. And hopefully, advocates around this province and people around this province will say these are too important to just throw out and go back to the days when, childcare was over $1,000 a kid, for instance, and parents had to shell out all the time at schools and couldn't count on a child benefit leveraging up the federal child benefit that's there, that has made a significant impact in this province, with dropping child poverty 50% in 2 years, so that 40,000 children, more than 50,000 Calgarians are lifted out of poverty as a result of this basic monies to them, which has aspects of basic income in it.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Joe, and congratulations on the fantastic work. And I hear you about the unraveling of programs. Where it's a lot of that going around, unfortunately. I'd like to move back to Hugh Siegel, though, and push back against basic income. And if I may be so bold, particularly around conservative thinkers, has often been about costs. And that was one of the arguments the new Ontario government used when canceling our pilot, that rolling it out to the general public would be simply unaffordable. Last year, when they ran the numbers, though, the Parliamentary Budget Office said it would cost $43 billion annually to implement a basic income across Canada. So my question for you, Hugh, is basic income a good investment?
Well, I think the numbers are very clear. That $43 billion that was referenced by the Parliamentary Budget Officer was not inclusive of the savings that would take place in the provinces, because that $43 billion would replace the amount of money the provinces now pay out for disability and welfare support, the existing cash transfers for people who have economic difficulties, not of their own creation. So, for example, in Ontario alone, as the Premier will know, the amount of money that is spent on a combination of Ontario Works, which is what welfare is called here, and disability support is just under 10 billion, repeat, billion a year, and that is just for Ontario. So the notion that that $43 billion number would be reduced massively because it would replace, if it was a national program, some existing cash transfer programs in the provinces, probably would take it down to something under 20 billion nationally. Now, 20 billion is less than 10% of the existing federal total budget, not counting crown corporations and other contingent liabilities elsewhere on the balance sheet. The notion that we could eradicate poverty for 10% of the federal budget, and then all the ensuing reductions in costs that would take place because there were less people living in poverty who were getting sick sooner, ending up in hospitals more quickly, having shorter and more difficult lives, less difficulties with issues such as education outcomes, which are always worse for low-income people. There'd be a whole bunch of substantial areas, as Dr. Forget's study in Manitoba indicated, where there would be serious reductions in existing overhead costs if we invested to reduce poverty. So I think it's a totally sustainable number. And for those people who argue on the far right usually that it's not affordable, they usually are not the people who are looking at the total coherent cost of poverty in and beyond what the actual dispensation of funds are to people living beneath the poverty line. And we know that when Don Drummond did a study for the Ontario Food Banks Association, very distinguished chief economist at the time for the Toronto Dominion Bank, he indicated that the actual cost of poverty, independent of what was being spent by the province on welfare and disability, was in excess of $7 or $8 billion a year to the economy in terms of productivity. We actually have labor shortages in Canada, and one of the things that welfare programs across Canada do is discourage people from working. So there's a whole bunch of productive benefits, greater liquidity, greater economic growth. We've seen that now with the child benefit. We've seen growth numbers in Canadian provinces where there are a lot of recipients, which are actually producing economic opportunity. So I don't buy the argument on cost at all. I think it's based on a very Scrooge-like approach to what public sector investment should be. I'm for balanced budgets. I don't enjoy the notion of large deficits, but there are also social deficits, and we have to make sure we understand the full cost of that if we're going to have a real analysis of both sides of the ledger.
Great. Yeah. Thank you very much, Hugh. And I want to continue on this thought back to Joe, most recently Alberta's finance minister. So he was referencing one report, and another report came out last week from the Ontario Association of Food Banks that pegged the annual cost of poverty and lost opportunities at $33 billion just here in Ontario alone. I know in Alberta, Vibrant Communities Calgary identified costs in social supports and homelessness, healthcare, in between 7 and 9.5 billion for Alberta taxpayers. So if we go on the basis of what Hugh said, that poverty is just costing us too much, how do we engage the public, particularly in places that may be more conservative minded about making these long-term investments like in basic income that are necessary to improve health, improve housing, and restore dignity for people?
Yeah, well, I think the Ontario Poverty Cost Report was excellent. The one that was just done recently, I think some folks from Alberta helped work on that. The 2013 Alberta Poverty Costs, I worked on that with the same team, and we modeled it on other poverty cost reports from across the country. Those kinds of reports absolutely get the attention of people in society, conservative-minded, more centrist and left-minded people. So it absolutely helped us make the case, and we put down a number of recommendations, almost all of which from a child benefit to combating the fight for Albertans who are disabled and trying to bring those benefits up, from indexing and increasing income supports and AISH, as I just mentioned, the disability benefits, and on and on and on. It brought people together around how do we reduce these costs to our society in Alberta, and we were able to engender a lot of support for doing things different than they've always been done. So I think pocketbook understanding of the government's finances helps a majority engage in, okay, how can we reduce these costs? And then you start to look at other options. And as I said, we absolutely ran with, because Rachel Notley wanted to make her legacy, an affordable child care program in this province, one that hadn't ever been here. And then we were able to show how much more could happen when parents could get back into the workplace, how much more our economy could improve. So I think the reports make a lot of sense. It gets people focused on, like Hugh was saying, how can we do things differently to reduce the costs? And we were quite successful for a period of time in doing that. And I hope we can continue to update our poverty cost report in Alberta, as well as work more closely across the country.
Great, thanks, Joe. So I think so far on the panel, we've established that basic income works, basic income is affordable. So now I'd like to move towards how we go about implementing a basic income in Canada, either at the national or provincial level. So back to you, Kathleen. Canada is perhaps, I would think, the most decentralized federation in the world, and provincial governments have responsibility for social services and a myriad of other human services. And yet the feds have taken steps through successful national programs that we've already talked about a bit, including the Guaranteed Income Supplement and the Canada Child Benefit, to reduce poverty for low-income families and seniors. So I'm curious whether in developing the Ontario Basic Income Pilot, if you ever approached the federal government. I know they were new, fairly new at the time. They had just recently got into office, but did you ever approach them to perhaps partner with Ontario on running the Basic Income Pilot? And as a supplement to that question, what do you think are, given some of the dynamics in federal-provincial relations, are some of the challenges to moving basic income forward in Canada?
Can I answer that question on October 22nd? Because I don't know. It's gonna depend. But let me just say that we worked very closely with the federal government on a number of things, and you will remember, Tom, that we were the province that was really pushing the enhancement to the retirement security, to the CPP. And the reason I raise that is that yes, we did talk to the federal government at the time. We talked to officials. My staff talked to staff in the federal government about partnering on a basic income pilot. That didn't go as far as we might have liked it to, but there certainly was an openness to the conversation, and I think the federal government, the recent federal government has demonstrated that they are interested in serious poverty reduction, particularly child poverty reduction. So I think where we're at is that there needs to be a continued federal provincial discussion. I'm really pleased that what's happening in PEI is happening, because I happen to believe that provincial governments have a lot to say about what that national discussion is. And if we can, at the provincial level, demonstrate, as I think we have in Ontario, that it's possible, that it's doable, that we need to move forward, then I think that becomes a more credible discussion at the national level. Sometimes it's the other way around. Sometimes the federal government has to take the lead. Obviously, it goes back and forth. But I think that on this one, where we are at right now is that provincial governments are going to need to continue to do the work to demonstrate that that there is efficacy and there is an argument for some kind of basic income. You know, I think that you were talking about the poverty reports and the economic realities. My problem has always been with accountants, not economists, because when you get down to the level of accounting, sometimes it's hard for the future cost benefit to be calculated as you want to implement a policy. And some of the outcomes in a program like the basic income will be immediate. The people who get jobs, you can count those things, but some of the outcomes take longer to be realized and are less quantitative, you know, so that measuring a stronger community, measuring a more inclusive community, measuring the volunteer capacity, that might be quantifiable, but it might be less visible. So I think that those are things that we need to work on together, provincially and federally, to make the argument. But I think that we're in a much better position today than we were even a decade ago to make that argument.
Great, thank you. Fascinating. And Kathleen referenced the work that Hannah and her colleagues are doing in PEI. So I'm wondering, Hannah, if you might have some advice for us, because as Kathleen alluded to, we're less than a week away from a federal election that very much looks like it will end up in a minority government situation. So from your experience on the island, what are some of the advantages to moving the idea of basic income forward politically when no one party has a majority in government?
Yeah, well, like I said, I completely agree with Kathleen. I think we can't really speak about what that relationship is going to look like until we know who's at the table for that relationship. But I think the other part that's really important in there, and we're early days, you know, in PEI, we're still fairly out of the honeymoon period, I think. But you know, I think I said, you know, when I talk about this before, I'm cautiously optimistic on behalf of, you know, my colleagues and the work that we're doing, because it's coming from a really clear foundation and a really clear mandate for the committee in this case in particular, that says, you know, we're coming back with an evidence-based recommendations, and we're coming back with recognizing that this is what this minority space and this new committee structure does, is give us the place where we can actually recognize that gives us a power to affect change. You know, it may be incremental, it may be, you know, phased. We don't know right now what that's going to like, but the fact that the conversation is happening around tangible, measurable goals and outcomes, you know, and I know, you know, Hugh has spoken about this. You've got to be working towards a goal. It's why even the language around elimination versus reduction is so important when we talk about poverty in the context of programming and services, because we know that the welfare model doesn't lift people out of poverty. Our welfare models will never change, are fundamentally you know, what happens in our communities, because they're not designed to lift people. They're not designed to treat people with dignity, and they're not designed to give people full citizenship. So you know, what we're looking at here in PEI is how do we structure something that we can do regardless of whether we have federal government support or not. So right now, federal government support may be data, and that would be fantastic. In fact, we've asked for that. But we have to be able to structure something that says we can make an impact within the space where we are without waiting for it to be somebody else's problem to solve. And I think that's a really empowering space to be in, and minority does allow you to do that. You know, I think the last point about that that's really important is, I think it's two important points. One is that, especially in PEI, a pilot doesn't mean a small group of people. A pilot could be a whole province. Right, a pilot is not necessarily, we tend to think of it as being a small group, but that's not necessarily the case. A pilot is trying things out and seeing what happens. measuring and really being clear about the before and after. And I really think Kathleen's point is important, that the opportunity cost of doing this outweighs the risk. The opportunity costs, which are not just about the fiscal cost, but the opportunity cost of not investing in our future populations, not taking care of people where they are, not building our communities, the healthcare outcomes, all of those pieces, really what we're seeing is that outweighs the risk of doing nothing at all.
Great. Thank you, Hannah.
Mm-hmm.
I want to move back to you, Joe, again. So looking at how we move the idea of basic income forward, putting on your hat as a member of the New Democrats, some on the left of the political spectrum have been reluctant to embrace the idea of basic income because there's some concern that it could divert resources from public services, like or a national child care program or other public investments. Do you feel like basic income is a this or that proposition, or is there room in the political dialogue for both basic income and having robust social programs like pharmacare, like national child care? What are your thoughts on that, Joe?
Yeah, with the government, new provincial government just being 6 months old in this province, my focus, the focus is on protecting the kinds of incremental improvements that were made under the previous government. So, forgive me, I'm not really thinking about basic income in Alberta right now. What I'm more concerned about is that we don't lose the increases to income support programs, AISH, and the indexing that we put in place for the first time in this province, that we don't lose our early childhood learning centers that we piloted and showed great improvement in family affordability as a result, and readiness for school for kids and parents being able to go out and get employment, that we don't lose the elimination of the predatory lending program that was in place prior to us coming in and us eliminating it. So I'm focused on those things, Tom, and that we don't, the clock doesn't get turned back by the current government, and we go back to basically a market-based approach. If you've got the money, you can do what you want to do. If you don't, well, it's your fault, kind of thing. I do care about things like the federal child benefit and that it stay in place. And I do care that we move further down the kind of just society provision of supports that are needed for people. But right now my focus is on the changes that are happening in this province, and that they don't continue, the current government doesn't continue to exacerbate and make things worse for low-income people and Albertans who have benefited from some of the important changes we put in place.
Thanks, Joe. So I have one more question, and then we'll get into any questions from viewers or listeners. But I want to go back to Hannah again. And Hannah, Prince Edward Island is probably the Canadian province that is most susceptible to global warming. So I'd actually love to approach this whole idea of basic income and climate change in an entirely separate webinar. But what do you think, how do you think basic income issues are linked to climate change, especially for islanders, as I mentioned, you could be most susceptible to the ravages of global warming?
Yeah, and it's a great question. I think it is absolutely an entirely other topic that we could spend another whole chunk of time on. We have the Institute for Climate Studies here at UPEI who've done an incredible amount of work that tells us what will happen here, not sort of in 200 years, but in 20 years or in 30 years. And we also have a huge amount of data that's available about sort of not just sort of the overall impacts, but about sort of how people move and change within the province. And we are, we're a rural economy, we're a seasonal economy. We have, really strong economic growth, but it is very much linked to the function and the space that we're in, the land and the sea and the connection there and how we live here. The thing I think that what is the connection that's really important between basic income and the impacts of climate change is something that Hugh talked about when he was with us recently at a committee meeting, was that we need to be really careful that when we think about who basic income supports, we're not talking about just people who are in some kind of social welfare program. We have, in every province, we will have people who are, in that space of needing welfare support for whatever reason that may be. But there are actually a much large percentage of people in every province who are working poor. They are working, as many hours as they can, 2 or 3 jobs. They're in minimum wage there, and they are paycheck to paycheck. They're the $200 away from a financial disaster. We talk about it here in PEI as more months than money. Right? So we saw the direct impact of that recently was when we were hit by Hurricane Dorian, which, as you know, on the East Coast it hammered the whole East Coast. And in PEI, we even though we knew it was coming, we weren't prepared in some ways for how incredibly impactful it was. People were out of power for ages, but the impact was about damage. And what we found was that there was a great relief program afterwards to help people fix roofs and all the pieces, but there's a deductible of $1,000. And with a deductible of $1,000, most people are not eligible for that program because they don't have $1,000. And we're not talking about sort of, people who you would consider to be poor. We're talking about regular, ordinary islanders. That's the gap. One small storm in the calendar of many, many storms, that's like the 4th one we've had this year, has actually put people into risk for not being able to maybe get ready for the winter. Maybe they're going to have to make some really tough choices about, can they afford heating this year, this to the same extent? Are they going to be able to buy new boots for their kids when they need them? Can they afford enough food? And in fact, the increase of people going to food banks after Dorian was in the hundreds of percentages increase. And a lot of it was just regular, ordinary people who had never been there before, because this tipped them over the edge. So what basic income, the context of that is what basic income does is allow people to manage in a space where our world is no longer what we expect it to be. And that's the reality of climate change now and in the future, is that we cannot prepare in any tangible way for what's coming other than giving people as many tools as possible to be able to take care of themselves. And a basic income does that.
Great. Well said, Hannah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Tom, it's
Yeah.
Kathleen. Can I just pick up on something that Hannah said, and that is,
Yeah.
She didn't use the word, but I think the discussion around climate change, the discussion around minimum wage, the discussion around the changing nature of work, I mean, it all points to a precariousness a precarity that people are dealing with. And I think that we can't have this conversation about basic income outside of the context of all of that. And, if I think about what's happening in Alberta right now, what Joe is talking about, the rollback of things like, in our case in Ontario, minimum wage, or the freezing of a minimum wage for the next number of years after we had raised it, and the lack of movement on moving it to $15 as we had committed to. All of those things contribute to the increased precarity and the increased gap between people who have and people who don't. And as Hannah has said, in our basic income pilot, it was not just people who were on social assistance who were part of that pilot. There were working poor people who were very much a part of it. So I think that context is really, really important.
Great. Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Kathleen, for that. So we're going to move to questions from listeners and from viewers. We have about 10 minutes left. So Natasha, if we have questions, perhaps folks can just type them in, or just unmute yourself and we'll try to get to them. Is everybody shy?
Tom, just while that's happening, the recession that has been going on in Alberta since 2014 here, I've neglected to kind of bring that into the discussion. I think I just forgot, because we're living in it all the time here, and it hooks up with Kathleen's precarity. point that life is very precarious in Alberta. Jobs are changing. Automation is changing the way the oil fields and that whole sector is kind of producing anymore. So we put in all these programs under an NDP government in the teeth, the biggest recession Alberta's ever seen, and it was having a positive effect on bringing up the level of people's income right across the province, while the recession was dampening the top level of income across the province. So, we showed that we could do things if we all work together. And as Kathleen in Ontario and us here, we're seeing that change with the new government's perspective, where we're putting a hold on those things. I mean, they're going back to old methods that haven't shown a benefit to low-income people. Yeah,
Excellent point. Okay, so we have a from Peter Buck. So Peter, are you able to unmute yourself?
I think I'm on. Can you hear me?
Yep, hear you great, Peter. Thanks.
Great. I really enjoyed the discussion. It's been really good. I do have a question about, as Kathleen Wynne pointed out, the precarious labor market we're dealing with. What risk is there that basic income for those people at the lower end of the labor market becomes a wage subsidy for employers? What protections do we have, not just to make sure the minimum wage legislatures aren't inclined to kind of keep the minimum wage low, but also that employers maybe even consider the living wage? How do we, like an adequate living wage, how do we have those kind of protections against those who are in the labor market, do need income support, but also a fair return on their labor?
Yeah, and that's an excellent question, Peter, and one that has been asked in relation to basic income for a number of years. So would anybody like to tackle it?
Hi, Peter. This is Hannah. It's a great question, and it's definitely a real risk, which we have to plan for when we're planning any rollout. I think you might have heard me mention earlier, with the work that we're doing with our committee here in PEI, we've included establishing the benchmark, establishing a living wage, separate from a minimum wage, what a living wage actually is, and that what the measures of poverty are, so that we're including those in the conversation. So we're not just doing basic income independent of the labor market, but we do need to be really careful that at the same time a basic income isn't connected to an expectation of labor market entry, because that tends to be one of the big challenges, is that basic income shouldn't be connected to your capacity to work, or what we define as work. And so we the flexibility in terms of what work looks like is very different. And a really good example of that is unpaid caregiving. That a huge percentage of our population do a huge amount of work which isn't paid, whether that's caring for children or caring for elders or people with disabilities. And basic income is one of the ways that they can be supported, and then therefore they can live in dignity as well as with the work they do. But so I guess the bigger piece is that those conversations shouldn't be separated, but that also it really does need to be enshrined in legislation and in the policy that arises from that legislation to protect it as governments change.
I do have another question from Michael. This is probably related to our experience in Ontario, so maybe I'll put it to Kathleen. But what government gives, another can take away. Should we embed a rights-based approach, specifically to basic income, I suppose? Kathleen?
Yeah, I've been asked that many times. How could we protect program changes, legislation against the vagaries of another regime? And Tom, I don't think there's a perfect answer to that. I think the best answer is that we build a public consensus, not just in the province but across the country. And I think that's why it's very important. My hope is that after the election, given what's happening in PEI, that there is a discussion at that national table that starts to put pressure on other provinces, starts to put pressure on the federal government. I think that it's a good thing that the PEI example is following fast and hard on the heels of what happened in Ontario, you know, so you build some momentum. But I think whether you have a constitutional protection or a legislative protection, those things can be changed. Some more difficult to change than the other, obviously, but there can always be a change if there's a change in philosophy. And I'd love to hear Hugh's take on this, because you know, he's a different party stripe than I am, but we work pretty closely together. Hugh, what do you think about that?
Well, I'm very much of the view that the question that underlies our challenge here is, why is it that governments are not engaging, except for Ontario, for example, and British Columbia, who has a commission of inquiry into a basic income, and what PEI is now doing, not engaging in a context where close to 74% of Canadians think a basic income would be the right next step to take in terms of economic opportunity and fairness. So the issue is always, you know, why would the proponents of a new proposition not be forced to offer substantive evidentiary-based proof that it's a good thing to do? That's a legitimate question. We should always ask that in a democracy. But why would the people who are in office, different political affiliations, who are ignoring the 74% of Canadians who think a basic income would be an important next step, why are they not embracing what the vast majority of Canadians think is worthwhile? So I do believe it's the public context, as Kathleen has said, but I also think that we are beginning to see an emergent role where various aspects of unfairness associated with poverty are being tested in the courts on occasion, in some circumstances, usually in terms of the fairness of a particular program. So I would not be surprised if over a period of time, as many of us work on the public consensus, we will begin to see some court decisions around implicit or explicit discrimination in some programs and in the way some parts of the economy operate that won't reinforce the debate. But I don't see holding up one for the other. I think both tracks will progress at their own speed. And those of us who are interested in the public context just have to keep our shoulder to the wheel. Great.
Thanks, Hugh. And we do have, just as the last question before we wrap up, Cody did type in his question. So maybe I'll put it to you again, Hugh, because you did write the playbook, I suppose, for the Ontario pilot. But Cody asked, my apologies, how would a basic income interact with existing approaches to assisting low-income students? Would it augment elements of the existing system, or would it replace existing methods of support, in your opinion?
Well, in the proposal for the pilot, which the province accepted, the range of people in terms of age who would be part of the test group was from 18 to 64. And there was a debate about those people who would still be at college or university, and who are, you know, not yet perhaps formally in the workforce. Why would they be included? Well, it's because we do actually have food banks on our campuses in Ontario and other provinces where kids are in some financial difficulty. While programs like OSAP and Canada Student Loan are there to be helpful, it's been the reality up until most recently that a welfare mother, for example, who decided that getting an education would be a great way to move ahead with her life and with her economic and social prospects, would be disqualified from getting welfare the minute she applied or he applied for OSAP, Ontario Student Awards Program. That's no longer the case, but it was the case, and it still is the case in many parts of the country. So I think we have to look at poverty where it exists, both amongst the working poor, both amongst students who don't have enough to get by, and make sure that we draft a program which gives them the contingent support that allows them to stay in a productive mode, connected to the academic world, to the work world, and make progress. And the notion that we would disconnect one from the other, in my view, makes no sense. Basic income is about a better way to finance, organize, and structure automatic cash transfers to those who live beneath the poverty line, whether they're working, whether they're students, or whatever their other status in life would be. And it's not about replacing any of the other programs, which are there for good and substantial other reasons.
And Tom, if I can just add to that, and to Cody, you know, the the viability or the generosity of those other programs is part of this conversation. It goes back to the context discussion. So in Ontario, before this current government was elected, we had put in place a free tuition program that actually allowed thousands of young people and people who were going back to school to go back, retrain, go into college or university. And I think that there could be a very a very symbiotic and strong relationship between a basic income program and a really viable tuition program that recognized that getting an education is part of what has to happen if we're going to have a strong economy as well. So again, it's that contextual piece. Unfortunately, that's been rolled back in Ontario as well. So anyway, onward and upward.
Onward and upward indeed. And that's a good way to end. This has been a fascinating discussion. I'd like to thank Hugh and Kathleen, Hannah and Joe for taking time out of their busy days to participate in this webinar. We'll make sure it's available in the next several days so we can share it on websites and social media. And once again, thanks for everybody who participated. I hope we'll be able to pick up this conversation again in the near future. We're pleased to announce that Hamilton will be hosting the North American Basic Income Congress later in the spring 2020. So this would probably be a great panel discussion at that event as well. So thanks everybody for participating. We will have information on future webinars in the coming weeks, and all the best. And don't forget to vote on Monday. Thanks everybody.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Tom.
Tom.
Bye, everyone.